In February of 1915, the 1st Canadian Division crossed the Channel and landed in France, finally arriving at the Western Front some 6 months after the heady days of August 1914, when it had been formed at Valcartier, Quebec. Since then, the division had spent the winter of 1914 on Salisbury Plain, continuing its training to bring the nearly 20,000 men who were largely militiamen and civilians before the war to a level of expertise that would see them able to take their place in the fight against the Germans. This training complete and its organization solidified, the 1st Canadian Division, the largest army Canada had ever fielded, moved into the line in a quiet sector near Armentières to learn the routine of trench life. With their introduction to the conditions on the Western Front complete, the division moved into the line in a sector of the Ypres salient, in fact the left of the BEF, next to the French. It would be there in April of 1915 that Canada and her soldiers would come face to face with the realities of modern warfare. In the afternoon of the 22nd of April, the Germans unleashed a huge cloud of chlorine gas in the face of Algerian and French territorial troops on the Canadian left. Stricken by these noxious vapors, the French troops withdrew in chaos and panic, choking and gasping, unable to breathe. This left a giant gap in the line on the northern flank of the salient, and with that, the Battle of Second Ypres had begun. With their left flank now completely exposed, the 1st Canadian Division struggled to readjust and stop the Germans flooding in behind them. All around the salient, what meager reserves there were, British and Canadian, were rushed up the line to try and stem the tide of field grey that was flowing toward Ypres. Among these reserves were 2 battalions of the Canadian Division, the 10th from Alberta and the 16th, drawn from 4 Highland regiments across Canada. These 2 battalions would win everlasting praise and honour for their efforts to dislodge the Germans from a wood which lay just outside the village of St. Julien. Previous to the war, this wood had been used by cooks and kitchen staff for fuel. Its Belgian name was Bois de Cuisinière. To the British and Canadians fighting for their lives around the Ypres salient, it had taken on a much more anglicised form, one that would become synonymous with one of the great Canadian battle honours of the Great War. Kitchener's Wood. The early days of Canada's commitment to fighting the Great War saw a nation vast in geography, yet small in population, raise an overstrength infantry division and a cavalry brigade. Despite seemingly overwhelming interference, special interest meddling, and a complete lack of infrastructure and materiel. Famously, the volunteers from across Canada boarded trains bound for the chosen point of assembly, a newly created camp hewn out of the forest at Valcartier, Quebec. They arrived from coasts east and west, the wide open prairies, the cities and towns of Ontario and Quebec, and even the north to be part of Canada's great effort. Canada's army of the early 20th century was made up of a small 3,000-odd man regular component known as the Permanent Active Militia. This was complemented by a larger, though part-time component known as the Non-Permanent Active Militia. The regular troops were organized into 2 small cavalry regiments, 1 single battalion infantry regiment, as well as 2 batteries of field artillery, 5 companies of garrison artillery, and supporting troops. The part-time militia was made up of a huge number of numbered infantry, cavalry, mounted rifle, and artillery units, each of which were notionally of battalion or regimental strength, but for the most part existed as greatly under-strength frameworks, depending on their location and geography. It would be to this huge polyglot of units that the task of providing men to Canada's first contingent would fall. In fact, Canada's regular soldiers of the Royal Canadian Regiment would be sent to Bermuda to relieve the regular British battalion posted there for service in France. Rather than using this existing framework to build an army around, the decision was made by the Minister of Militia, Sam Hughes, to nearly completely ignore this existing system and instead create a whole new organization that would be Canada's Army in the Field. This would become known as the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Upon its formation, this so-called 1st Contingent consisted of 4 infantry brigades, some 16 battalions. Later, this would be trimmed down to 12, so that it matched the order of battle for an Imperial Infantry Division, while also providing for a modicum of reinforcement. The existing and well-established regiments of the militia, such as the 2nd Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, the 48th Highlanders, both from Toronto, or the 5th Royal Highlanders from Montreal, were reduced to mere manpower reserves as they dutifully dispatched drafts to Valcartier, which numbered, in some cases, nearly all the men of that unit. One such battalion, which would win everlasting laurels at Kitchener's Wood, was itself a microcosm of the CEF. The 16th Battalion had been formed at Valcartier from a collection of drafts from all over Canada, each not quite big enough to fill its own battalion. 530 men came from the 72nd Seaforth Highlanders of Canada in Vancouver, 250 from the 79th Cameron Highlanders of Canada from Winnipeg, 230 from the 50th Gordon Highlanders in Victoria, and 140 men from the 91st Canadian Highlanders of Hamilton, Ontario. This battalion would serve throughout the war, and interestingly, for the greater part of the early war, would maintain the character and tartan of each of its constituent units. Its famous badge, although designed by the officers during the voyage to Britain, would remain unissued for the early part of the war, and the badges of its antecedent regiments continued to be worn. Throughout the remainder of the summer and on into the autumn, by hook or by crook, the mass of volunteers, many of whom were pre-war militiamen, but a great many had been mere civilians before August, were pushed, cajoled, convinced, or persuaded into some semblance of a military force. New rifles were issued, the Mark III Ross. These replaced the older Mark II versions that the militia had been armed with since the early 1900s. Within a few short weeks, however, reports began to surface about disturbing difficulties with their rifles. There were problems with them jamming and a propensity for damage to their bolts. There were some measures taken to remedy this, though through the general chaos of mobilization it was unclear if these were undertaken correctly. History would show that there were many faults with the Ross that would take time that was not always available to fix. Machine guns, artillery, horses, and other items were all in short supply, but by early October it was deemed ready enough to set sail overseas. Landing in Britain, the CEF encamped on Salisbury Plain to continue its training. Thus, a pitiful period was suffered in harsh winter conditions, with poor infrastructure and limited training facilities. By February, the 1st Canadian Division was deemed ready for service. The deficient Oliver pattern equipment that the men had suffered with, both at Valcartier and Salisbury Plain, was replaced with up-to-date 1908 pattern Webb equipment. They would, however, maintain their Ross rifles and Colt machine guns. The men of the Canadian Division resembled their British counterparts in silhouette, but differed somewhat in detail. As was universal in the early 20th century, the entire army went to the field dressed in what was known as service dress. Made of wool, the Canadian pattern tunic had 7 buttons, a stand-up collar, and certain patterns had colored shoulder straps. This was complemented by a flat-topped, peaked forage cap and boots with long puttees. The British pattern 5-button service dress tunic was also very common, especially in the kilted battalions. Of the 12 battalions in the Canadian Division, fully 3 were kilted: the 13th, the 15th, and the 16th, all of which were grouped together in the 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade. Another important point to consider was the fact that helmets had not yet made their appearance on the Western Front. The peaked cap, or, in kilted battalions, the Glengarry, with a smattering of the newly issued Balmoral bonnets, were the headdress worn in the line. There were other, more fundamental changes that happened also on the eve of the division's sailing to France. Upon mobilization, and throughout its period of training at Valcartier and Salisbury Plain, the battalions of the CEF were organized using the well-established 8-company Orbat, as had been used with little change from Napoleonic times. Indeed, the British Army maintained this as well until 1913, when the decision to adopt a 4-company Orbat was instituted. This new organization was seen as much more appropriate on a battlefield that had become increasingly dispersed, giving more control to lower-level commanders and reducing the span of control of the commanding officer from having to deal with 8-company commanders down to just 4. For some strange reason, the Boffins in Ottawa had not initially sought to bring the Canadian infantry into line with the remainder of the Empire. The early months of training, in fact, saw head-shaking vacillation as they flip-flopped back and forth, deciding to adopt the new 4-company organization, but then, frustratingly, renege and readopt the old 8-company one. The final decision in favor of the 4-company version was made just days before the division crossed the Channel. With increased responsibility, company commanders became majors, nominally anyway. This new organization would also see the introduction of a new layer of command, the platoon. Though not having the same tactical autonomy as the platoon would later in the war, in 1915 it was nevertheless extremely important for maneuver and fire control. It was commanded by a subaltern, a second lieutenant or lieutenant, and he was assisted by a number of NCOs, a sergeant to act as second in command, and 4 corporals, each to command one of the 4 sections in his platoon. 4 such platoons were grouped in the company, under the command of the aforementioned major, who was assisted by a captain second in command, and a newly created position of company sergeant major. Added to this was, of course, the machine gun section, the staff, the band, the drums, signalers, and pioneers, all for a total of just over 1,000 all ranks. The German army of 1915 was, like its opponents on the Western Front, trying to come to grips with the fact that the titanic struggles of 1914 had not borne the fruit expected. Now, they had to find some way to achieve victory. The German army had increased in size as the front had coalesced from Switzerland to the Channel, and similar growing pains were being experienced as truly industrial warfare was now becoming a complete reality. 1915 saw the initiation of economy measures in uniforms and equipment. The distinctive 1910 pattern tunic, with its buttons and cuffs and other embellishments, was augmented with a plainer version, the 1915 pattern. The Argentinian leather, from which their well-known pickelhaubes were made, became scarcer and scarcer as the effect of the British naval blockade became more acute. Versions in fiber and steel were produced, and increasingly the distinctive spike was removed or the undress cap substituted. The steel helmet, or Stahlhelm, had not yet entered service, so, like their British opponents, there was no protection for the head. The German army had entered into the war with the same number of machine guns per division as the British, 24, but in 1915 this began to increase as the defensive benefits to their greater numbers was exploited. The German infantry were organized within their division into 2 brigades of 2 regiments, each with 3 battalions, and a 6 and later 12-gun machine gun company. With the battalion establishment at just over 1,000, this gave the German infantry division a similar infantry strength to their British counterpart. In preparation for the attack on the 22nd of April, certain German units were issued with rudimentary gauze-style gas masks, which were intended to be tied over the nose and mouth. They don't seem to have been issued for the actual assault, but rather as personal protective equipment when needed. The evolution of the attack was to rely on the wind carrying the gas in front of the assaulting battalions. For the most part, this was effective, although the lack of sophistication would cause many friendly casualties. Fully formed and trained, the Canadian division headed for the coast and embarked at Avonmouth. They landed in France at Saint-Nazaire and began their long journey to the Western Front. Captured here on film are men of the 16th awaiting their trains from St. Nazaire. Note the antecedent cap badges and headdress, the Mark III Ross rifles, and the optimistic inclusion of an officer's sword. It had been 6 months since the heady days of August, and the 1st Canadian Division had come a long way. As with most formations new to the Western Front, it was decided to put them into the line in a quieter sector, so that the routines, precautions, and dangers of trench life could be absorbed. The division went into the southern part of the British sector, outside of Armentières, and subsequently conducted tours in other parts of the line. The division found itself integral to the attack at Neuve-Chapelle, where they supported the assaulting divisions on the left, with their rifle and machine gun fire. Their Ross rifles continued to give them trouble, however. Since being in France, more problems had been experienced with the use of British ammunition, which was made with wider tolerances, and as a result, jammed in the Ross's tight chamber. In April, they were moved to the very left of the British line, as part of General Plumer's 5th Corps, to an area of the line that had seen a cataclysmic battle in late 1914, and would again before anybody could expect it. The Ypres salient. The division occupied a 2.5-mile stretch of trenches between the Poelcapelle Road and Gravenstaffel. On the division's left was the French 45th Algerian Division, and beyond them the 87th Territorial Division. To their right was the British 28th Division, and further on down the line, the British 27th. This was at the very heart of the cauldron of the Ypres salient. Even casual students of the Great War will be quite familiar with the system of trenches as was practiced on the Western Front. Within this system, there were layers of deployment that tactically stretched back as far as the 1860s. 3 lines were used, each with its own role: the firing line, the supports, and the reserve. The firing line was where the active fighting took place, with troops firing their rifles and machine guns. The supports were positioned slightly to the rear and provided the capacity for immediate reinforcement to the firing line. The reserve was notionally kept out of the fight and was used to reinforce success or cover a withdrawal. While this 3-tiered system was certainly in use, what is important to understand, however, is that the trench system was not yet defined to such a complete state in large parts of the line. The Canadian sector before Ypres in April 1915, which itself had only just been taken over from the French, was a much less refined and complete example, as was the case in large parts of the Western Front. Here we see a much more fragmented layout. While the firing line was the most complete trench, it too had gaps where it crossed impassable terrain or due to other unforeseen events such as flooding. The support positions, as well as the reserve positions, were very underdeveloped, and were poorly connected or not even connected at all, left to right or front to rear. Another important aspect of the reality of this time was that the system of digging had not yet fully developed either. The customary traverses and firing bays that most will be familiar with were conspicuous in their absence in many parts of the Ypres salient in 1915. Many trenches were straight or just gently curved, giving no protection from enfilading fire. With regards to how the trenches were occupied, nominally the system could look similar to this. A battalion might have 2 companies in the firing line, one left, one right. A 3rd company would form the supporting element and be positioned slightly behind the firing line. The remaining company would be placed in reserve, out of the fight, but ready to react. Alternately, 3 companies could be in the line, each fielding their own local support, with the 4th company kept in the customary reserve position. Although, in principle, this system was extant on the Western Front, circumstances of geography and battlefield expediency could alter it significantly. Distances between these positions could be very close, or stretch to many hundreds of yards. Reserve positions could, especially in the early part of the war, only consist of pre-positioned troops without any degree of pre-dug fortification. As time would progress, the system would evolve into the gargantuan construct that most of us will be familiar with. Notwithstanding the rotation of units in and out of the line, the disposition of the Canadian Division on the morning of the 22nd of April was as follows. As alluded to, not all the division's units were in the front-line trenches. These were held by elements of the 2nd and 3rd Brigade, on the right and left of the division's sector, respectively. Only 2 battalions of each were actually holding the forward trenches. The 13th and 15th on the left, and the 5th and the 8th on the right. Each battalion in the firing line had 3 companies forward. Just behind, on the slopes of the Gravenstoffel Ridge, lay a series of supporting positions, the most prominent of which was a complex of redoubts known as Locality C, which had been sited and dug by the French before the Canadians had relieved them. The 4th companies from each of the battalions were tasked with manning these defences. To the rear, further elements were held in Brigade Reserve. The 14th Battalion, acting as the 3rd Brigade Reserve, was split between Saint-Jean with 3 companies and Saint-Julien with the remaining company and the machine gun section. Acting as the 2nd Brigade Reserve, the 7th Battalion was in the area of Fort-Juin. The remaining 2 battalions of the forward brigades had been detached and sent back to Ypres to act as the divisional reserve. These battalions, the 10th and the 16th, were billeted in the north of the town near the Yser Canal. 2.5 miles to the west was the entire 1st Brigade, which lay in Corps Reserve. It was preparing to support operations further to the south, around Hill 60. So, as we can see, the Canadian Division was fragmented to a degree, but its disposition was quite conventional in the context of holding the line. The relative calm of the preceding weeks would not last long. Although subject to constant but periodic shelling, sniping, and other less lethal embuggerances, the day of 22nd April would plunge the Canadian Division into not only one of their most horrific battles, but one of the most horrific battles ever. In the first few weeks of April, information surfaced regarding a strange and as of yet unheard of German plan. Statements from prisoners and other intelligence from spies, and indeed by observation of the German positions, seemed to corroborate the fact that the Germans intended to use poison gas as part of an attack in the Ypres salient. Not much attention seems to have been paid for various reasons, including the incredulity that the Germans would even consider such a thing, and the focus on fighting further south in the salient, around Hill 60. Business as usual continued throughout the day. But things were about to change. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, however, the French positions to the left of the Canadians came under a fierce bombardment, which then shifted onto the Canadian trenches. Larger and heavier shells began also to fall in the town of Ypres. Observing to their front and to their flanks as they could, elements of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Brigade, with the left being held by the 13th Battalion, began reporting that just after 1700 hours, and off to their left flank, a strange cloud of green vapor several hundred yards in length was forming and moving between the enemy trenches and the French. A fury of small arms fire and French 75mm artillery fire at once began, but this tapered off dramatically very soon after it began. This cloud of gas didn't impinge on the Canadian positions, but as it drifted steadily south, French troops could be seen streaming before it, back towards Ypres. The reality of the attack had seen the better part of 2 French divisions gassed with high concentrations of chlorine, released from cylinders dug into the German trenches. Unable to see, breathe, or fight, they had essentially disintegrated, leaving a massive hole in the Allied line. It soon became very apparent that the Canadian flank was compromised. As the messages were passed and the strange enemy activity came to the attention of the remainder of the division, all over the area of operations, troops were standing to and reserves were being called forward. The exact gravity of the attack took a while to become clear, but as streams of French troops began appearing at the Yser Canal, choking and gasping, it became clear that the situation was indeed dire. After a short while, reports began reaching Corps and Army headquarters. Everywhere, units in reserve began urgently moving to try and plug the huge gap that now existed in the line. Lieutenant Colonel Leckie had been the commanding officer of the 72nd Seaforth Highlanders of Canada before the war. In fact, their first and only commanding officer, as they had been raised in 1910. Now in command of the 16th Battalion Canadian Expeditionary Force, he was aware that something was amiss, yet not fully abreast of the situation. With his battalion in their billets on the northern edge of the town of Ypres and along the Yser Canal, he received orders from the 3rd Brigade headquarters to stand to. Shelling of the town continued, and growing steadily, a flow of French troops, civilian refugees, and general rearward activity. The history of the 16th Battalion quotes, "Gradually it dawned on the mind that through the employment of some mysterious weapon of offense, a disaster had been brought about. The look of terror in the eyes of the retreating soldiers could not have been produced by any known means of fighting. The men hastily turned out from their billets, dressed in greatcoat and marching order, and moved quickly to their positions on the western bank of the canal, where they proceeded to occupy what trenches were there, and to dig new ones if necessary. About 7:40 in the evening, a message arrived instructing the 16th Battalion to move at once to the brigade headquarters, which was located some 2.5 miles away at Mousetrap Farm. As a battalion in reserve, forward movement could only mean one thing. The situation was not progressing as planned up the line. Colonel Leckie ordered an extra emergency ration and 2 extra bandoliers per man to be issued. "These are for you."
250 rounds. Jesus.
Similar orders had been received by the division's other reserve battalion, the 10th. They too were making preparations to head up the line. Once the preparations were complete, these 2 battalions marched off into the gloom of the evening, committing them to what would be one of their most famous actions of the war. They weren't the only ones moving. On the Canadian right, Brigadier Currie, the commander of the 2nd Brigade, had ordered his reserve battalion, the 7th, up to Gravenstaffel Ridge to support his front-line battalions. Although his brigade was the farthest away from the current action, he had to make ready to fight as well, lest the Germans develop their attack further to the east. The 3rd Brigade Reserve Battalion, the 14th, was also making its way forward. It would see itself committed piecemeal all across the open left flank, trying to stem the German tide. The release of the gas at 1700 hours that afternoon had been a great success, with 2 French divisions broken and retreating. The Germans were approaching the second line of the salient defenses. For the British, this was known as the General Headquarters, or GHQ line. This partially finished line of trenches and redoubts was the last series of prepared positions before Ypres. The 14th Battalion was ordered to occupy parts of this line around the 3rd Brigade headquarters at Mousetrap Farm. Although the Germans hadn't made it quite that far yet, they were certainly threatening. By late evening, the Germans had penetrated some 2 miles up to Mauser Ridge, overrunning the secondary French defenses, and were only 2 miles from the town. They had arrived astride the Poelcapelle Road and were threatening St. Julian, where but 2 companies, one each from the 14th and 15th Battalion, along with 2 machine guns, had stood to, awaiting the onslaught. They had also got across the Yser Canal at Het Saas. They had advanced so far, so fast, that they had overrun part of the artillery positions that were in the Canadian Division's rear, causing a hurried withdrawal of their most precious assets. Not all, however, had got away, and the heavy guns of a British Royal Garrison artillery battery had been lost. This battery had been located in a wood, which had proved an excellent hiding spot some 2 miles behind the lines, but now was the very frontier between the 2 sides. Consisting mainly of oak trees, it had taken on an anglicized version of the French bois de cuisinière, used by cooks and kitchen staff before the war, or perhaps by the French when they occupied this part of the line. It had become known as Kitchener's Wood. Having cleared it, the Germans moved past and dug a single trench to reinforce the position just outside the southern edge of the wood. It took nearly 2 hours for the battalion to reach brigade headquarters. Shelling and ornery mules carrying the reserve ammunition played havoc. Finally, near 10 p.m., the battalion shuffled off the road and shook out in the fields round Mousetrap Farm. Although the Germans had paused after some 4.5 hours of steady advance, the only forces blocking them were a few companies of infantry arriving on this new battlefield. They were from battalions all over the 5th Corps. Elements of the 3rd Middlesex and 2nd East Kent were among them, busily digging in near St. Jean. In time, more would arrive, along with the 1st Canadian Brigade, but that would be later. Colonel Leckie reported to Brigadier General Turner at Mousetrap Farm and received his orders. Details were few and coordination somewhat lacking. At this critical hour, the most important aspect was time. The attack had to happen soon. Accordingly, the orders were brief and gave only the most basic of information. They read, 10th and 16th Battalions in that order will counterattack at 11:30 p.m. Battalions will assemble at C-23A, north of GHQ line. Clearwood, C-10D, direction northwest to U-27. Attack on frontage of 2 companies, remaining 6 companies in close support at 30 yards distance on same frontage. Artillery shell C-5C and northwest of that square. Signed, Garnet Hughes, Lieutenant Colonel, 3rd Infantry Brigade, 10:47 p.m. In an effort to strike back and destabilize the greater German advance, the 16th Battalion would attack in support of the 10th Battalion, and together would clear Kitchener's Wood. Originally, the hour for the attack had been 10:30, but this proved to be impossible. The start line would be crossed at 11:30. The designated forming up place was just off the road to St. Julien to the west, near about 1,000 yards from the wood. The night was clear, and for the initial hours at least, the moon shone brightly. The 2 battalions marched into their places and formed up thus. Adopting a formation that harkened back to the days of a bygone era, in the lead, the 10th Battalion formed on a 2-company frontage, each in 2 ranks with some 30 yards between. This was supported by the other companies in the same formation. The 16th adopted virtually the same, so that together they made a total of 8 waves. The attack was to be launched quickly and without nuance, and one wonders what the decision-making was that led to such a dense formation. Undoubtedly, control issues, lower visibility during the night, moonlight notwithstanding, and sufficient weight to the attack were all factors. To the modern eye, it seems somewhat suicidal. The vulnerability of such a formation would seemingly doom it to failure. While Colonel Boyle's 10th Battalion would lead the attack, the companies of Colonel Leckie's 16th Battalion would be commanded by the following. In the lead would be Numbers 2 and 4 Company, commanded by Captain Ray and Captain Geddes, respectively. Following on was Number 1 and Number 3 Company, under Captain Ross and Captain Merritt, respectively. These officers were representative of the constituent units of the 16th, the Seaforths, the Camerons, and the Gordons. Attached would be the bomber sections of the 2nd and 3rd Brigade. These were specialized troops in 1915, trained to throw hand grenades in both attack and defense. In addition, there was a machine gun section of 1 machine gun under Captain Tupper, which would follow along in the wake of the 16th. The men had turned out from their billets in Ypres, wearing greatcoats and marching order. For infantry in the attack, it was desirable to be as lightly encumbered as possible. Thus, the battalion underwent the time-honored but practical tradition of stripping for action. First, the order to remove packs was issued. This moderately complicated evolution involved removing the equipment and undoing the straps that held the pack in place. Once this was accomplished, the next order was greatcoats off. The men removed their heavy coats and placed them on the ground, along with their packs, in long, neat rows. Finally, though not without some apparent second-guessing, the penultimate order before stepping off. To the men standing in ranks, this would only mean one thing. They were going in. with the noise of metal scraping metal, accompanied by hundreds of clicks. The battalion fixed bayonets. The last-minute adjustments had given further delay, and 0 hour had now been set for 11:45. As the time ticked down, Canon Scott, one of the chaplains of the 3rd Brigade, was seen weaving in and out of the ranks, offering encouragement. "It's a great day for Canada, boys. A great day for Canada." His was perhaps the only voice. Most were looking inward in quiet, if nervous, contemplation. The distant crump of the shells fired by the supporting battery at targets in depth could be heard as watches ticked towards 0 hour. Thus, the 2 battalions stepped off for their date with destiny. The advance was conducted in silence, with only the footsteps of the men and the gentle slap of the bayonet scabbards against their thighs betraying their movement. Although mostly open fields, there was a considerable number of hedges and ditches that needed to be navigated, and this caused for some delay in the rate of advance. History would record this as being the very first attack made by Canadian troops during the Great War. The division had been in and out of the line many times since it had arrived on the Western Front in February. Casualties had been taken, and elements had even supported the attack on Neuve-Chapelle with their rifle and machine gun fire a month previous. But this, crossing no man's land, knowing little of the ground, towards an unknown enemy, was a whole new experience for Canada's fledgling army. About 300 yards from the German positions, there lay a substantial hedge, which was supported by heavy wire. This proved to be a most difficult obstacle to navigate, and much noise was made by the men forcing their way through. After reforming on the other side, the advance continued. It's hard to say if the Germans were alerted to the 2 battalions pushing through the hedge, but shortly thereafter, a single flare, followed by a great many more, were fired into the night sky. Rapid fire immediately erupted from the edge of the wood and the German trench just before. Bullets were ripping fast, fellows dropping everywhere. I held my hand in front of my face to ward off the bullets, quoted one participant of the attack. The attack wavered slightly, but the officers and NCOs were able to get the men moving, and quickly the advance continued. Breaking into double time, the 1,600 men in the attack plunged headlong towards the German defenses. From this point on, confusion grew. The chaos of first contact and the impetus of the grave task at hand saw the 16th Battalion veer slightly to the right off of their prescribed axis, behind the 10th Battalion. The leading ranks were taking fearful punishment from both their front and from machine gun positions off to their left flank. This was no time to stop, and they pressed on. As the leading men of the 16th, now clear of those of the 10th in front, approached the German trench, the enemy became visible and firing erupted. The confusion was significant. Men were moving, men were shooting. Men were lost and looking for leadership. But as they approached, perhaps due to the gravity of the rest of the attack off to their left, the Germans in the trench put up little resistance and began fleeing back into the wood. The men cheered as they sensed the enemy melting away. "Come on, Seaforths! Come on, Camerons! Come on, the 16th!" By this point, the ordered lines that had marked the beginning of the attack had completely disintegrated, as men fell, and others outpaced those in front as they ran for the shelter of the wood, where, it was expected, the Germans would continue the fight. For the most part, on reaching the German trench, the men of the 16th found it deserted. Dead men and equipment lay at its bottom. It wasn't very deep, and indeed how could it be, as the assaulting waves of the German 51st and 52nd Reserve Divisions had only reached the wood that afternoon. The 16th men spread out and cleared its length. While some men pushed on into the wood, others got about engaging the withdrawing Germans from the comparative safety of the trench. Any pause that occurred at the trench was not long. The task had been to clear the wood, and that's just what the men of the 10th and the 16th were going to do. It's impossible to speak to the nature of the fighting in Kitchener's Wood with any kind of clarity. It was dark, both units were mixed up with each other, and the place was crawling with Germans. Some were running, but most were making a stand, hiding behind trees, and appearing and vanishing in the gloom. This was no cause for set-piece attacks and detailed timetables. This was gutter fighting. A diary entry from a man of the 16th reads, "I vaguely saw some Germans and rushed to the nearest one. My bayonet must have hit his equipment and glanced off, but luckily for me, another chap running beside me bayoneted him before he got me. I was wildly excited and shouting, and rushing into the wood up a path towards a big gun which was pointed away from us. Going through the wood we ran into several Germans, but I had now lost confidence in my bayonet, and always fired. The 16th Battalion history goes on. Some groups were endeavoring to work around the trench at the southwest corner of the wood. Others went straight forward into the gloom of the wood, stalking and charging into the dark shapes of the abandoned guns of the British Territorial Battery, which neither the 10th nor the 16th had been told were there. One can only imagine the conditions in the wood. The darkness turned all but the most intimate surroundings into a complete mystery. Direction and orientation became lost. One moment, a man might have been fighting alongside a dozen or more men from either battalion. The next moment, he might have found himself alone in a sea of darkness with the noise of battle all around. The shouts and the screams of men fighting for their lives, and the ebb and flow of small arms fire echoing from an invisible skirmish. Then, appearing suddenly, the enemy, wide-eyed and in the same confused and disoriented but equally determined state. Instantly moving, he who reacted first would win. Desperate lunges with the bayonet, hurried shots with the rifle, and it would be over. Then, on again deeper into the wood. Just as fast as he found himself alone, a grateful rendezvous with others in the same position, and together, moving, hunting, and clearing the wood of whatever enemy they could find. With the chaos in the wood far from over, parties of men found that their route through the trees took them to the northern edge. From there, patrols were sent forward to probe for German positions behind the wood. The situation was far from stable, and the Germans were themselves attempting to push back into their former positions. A small party under Lance Corporal Wallace found themselves in a clearing at the north side of the wood. Out of the night came a similar-sized party of the enemy. With their challenges going unheeded, Wallace ordered rapid fire. The leader of the enemy patrol fell in a hail of bullets, and the remainder turned on their heels and ran. Colonel Leckie found himself in this same area, and gathering as many men as he could from both battalions, about 400 or so, he set about digging in along a hedge that ran out from a finger of the wood. The position was under continuous fire, and the ground was very difficult to dig into, especially with the rather impotent entrenching tools the men had at their disposal. Although the wood, for the most part, had been cleared, the tactical situation was not by any means stable. Horrendous casualties had been suffered by both battalions, and the shock and confusion of the attack had split them both into countless small groups. It would take time to reorganize. Colonel Leckie was still alive, but Colonel Boyle of the 10th had been wounded as he entered the wood and could not direct his men on the spot. Not that formal chains of command were able to be observed anyway. The process of first assessing the situation, finding someone to command a given locality, and ensuring that all were briefed, after all the fighting, was a Herculean task. Although the original intent was to have supported the attack on both flanks, with units from the Canadian Division, the British 5th Corps, and the French, these had come to naught. And now what existed amounted to a local penetration of the German line, which had formed a small salient of sorts, the Germans being on three sides and able to dominate the wood with their fire. Surely a significant German counterattack was developing, and would be launched sometime in the near future. Reinforcements had been sent for, and near 2 a.m., elements of the 2nd Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Watson had arrived at the German trench south of the wood. The remainder of the night was spent trying to consolidate the precarious position. The German presence on the flanks was maintained, and as the hours ticked by, Colonel Leckie and the other senior officers were faced with a difficult decision. They were going to have to retire. As dawn would be breaking shortly, this dangerous evolution would have to take place soon. Gradually, the exhausted men who had survived the attack on Kitchener's Wood were withdrawn to take positions in the now reversed German trench that they had only just captured some 4 hours before. The men were shattered and suffering significantly from the impact of the night's fighting. The 16th History quotes, "Up near the apex of the salient where the survivors of the 10th and 16th battalions were hanging on, there was a lull. The shouting and the rifle fire had died down, and in the trench south of the wood, the men of these units who had survived the ordeal of the night were trying to adjust themselves to the new situation." In the dawn, the fellows looked frightfully tired and discouraged. Suddenly word came along that the Germans were attacking, and before they could be stopped, almost every man was up on the parapet firing away as fast as he could. "As nothing happened, we were a little ashamed of this excitement," wrote a diarist. As it was, the morning of the 23rd came without incident for the remaining men of the 10th and 16th. Their night had made history for their country. Not that any were thinking such things, of course. Both battalions had suffered a huge number of killed, wounded, and missing. Both had begun the attack with near 800 men, but now were mere shadows of their former selves. There were fewer than 500 men left between them. The 23rd passed without the expected counterattack. Although the 16th suffered from spates of enemy rapid fire, there was no attempt to push the Canadians back. The attack on Kitchener's Wood had stabilized that sector of the front line for the time being. Further to the west, however, there remained dangerous gaps devoid of defenses or even troops to plug them. There were desperate efforts by combined British and Canadian battalions in an attempt to establish organized resistance between Kitchener's Wood and the Yser Canal. There, the Germans had captured the greater part of Mauser Ridge. The 24th of April saw the German effort shift to the east, up at what had become known as the apex of the salient. Battle raged as remorseless attacks were launched to reduce the positions held by the remainder of the 3rd Brigade and the 2nd Brigade. With the 16th still holding the line south of Kitchener's Wood, their sister battalion, the 15th, holding the line in front of Gravenstaffel Ridge, would suffer the second gas attack of the war. There, along with their comrades of the 8th Battalion, would fight a desperate defense, being forced to use their handkerchiefs soaked in their own urine in a pitiful effort to protect themselves from the noxious vapors. As the gas cloud drifted over the men of the 15th and the 8th, the battle for the apex had begun. The 10th Battalion, who had been holding the line along with the 16th, were sent at best speed very early in the morning of the 24th to bolster the positions on Gravenstaffel Ridge, and would be heavily involved yet again for the fight for Locality C. Finally relieved by the 2nd Battalion, the 16th were withdrawn the half-mile back to the reserve trenches of the GHQ line, and would remain there until the 26th of April, when they were moved to the west bank of the Yser Canal, into reserve. There, the 16th remained for the rest of the battle that became known as 2nd Ypres. The 28th of April saw drafts of reinforcements join the battalion, 91 men from the 50th Gordons, who had remained in England back in February, and another 220 men under Major Peck. The battalion was certainly in need of a rest along with the remainder of the division, but the Second Battle of Ypres would last much longer. It would drag on well into May, with the loss of the village of St. Julien and the battle around Friesenberg Ridge. There, the men of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the last privately raised regiment the Empire would ever see, would win everlasting laurels for their dogged defense of the ridge, whilst serving with the British 27th Division. They would be reduced by the end of the battle to a mere 150 men. Truly a titanic struggle. These maps, as found at thecanadianencyclopedia.ca, show with clarity the various stages of the first half of the battle. Subsequent to this, Sir John French, the commander-in-chief of the BEF, ordered a withdrawal from the dangerous eastern extremity of the salient. This would lead to the fighting around the aforementioned Friesenberg and Bellewaerde Ridge. When the last German attacks petered out in mid-May, the salient, albeit greatly reduced, would still be held by Allied forces. The town of Ypres continued to be remorselessly bombarded, and its gradual reduction to rubble was well underway. The salient and the town would see near constant fighting for the next 3 years. The determined defense of Ypres throughout the 3 major battles and countless smaller actions would solidify its legendary status as the heart of the last bastion of unoccupied Belgian territory, and a symbol of relentless determination and sacrifice. For the Canadian Division, 2nd Ypres was its first major action. The first of many lessons were absorbed, and shortly the division, renamed the 1st Canadian Division, would be joined by the 2nd Canadian Division to form the embryonic Canadian Corps that would, as the war progressed, become one of the premier fighting formations of the BEF. For the men of the Canadian Division, in May of 1915, it was a time for rest and recuperation. Thousands of men had been lost, and significant gaps in the ranks needed to be filled. Greatly significant to the men who had suffered with its foibles and unreliability in action, the Ross rifle began to be unofficially replaced. Stoppages, jams, and breakages had all been experienced in huge numbers during the battle, and in a grassroots, though quiet rebellion, men and commanders began to seek out British rifles, the SMLE, to replace their unreliable weapons. This unofficial action would eventually be ratified in June of 1915, with orders from General French to replace the Ross with the Lee-Enfield in the 1st Canadian Division. The story of the Ross is long and complicated, but its demise as a frontline weapon began in the aftermath of the Second Battle of Ypres. It would take until 1916 for all Canadian troops to be re-equipped, with instructions from General Haig ordering the replacement of the Ross in Canadian divisions. Following the gas attack of the 22nd of April, there was considerable panic as this new weapon had no defense. 2 days later, when gas was again used, but this time on the Canadians of the 15th and 8th Battalions, the only defense had been a urine-soaked handkerchief. Within weeks, the first anti-gas equipment was being issued. This took the form of a simple gauze pad soaked in chemicals and a pair of sealed goggles. By mid-1915, the first respirators were being distributed. The hypo, or smoke helmet, was a simple fabric bag soaked in chemicals and provided with a visor. These would in turn be replaced by the only slightly more sophisticated P and PH hood. Finally, by 1917, the first modern military respirator was issued, the smallbox respirator. This would be used for the remainder of the war and on in modified form until the middle of the Second World War, when a lightweight, single-piece version was issued. Gas changed warfare forever, and the threat of its use would affect operations right up to the modern era. The First and Second Gulf Wars would see universal use of anti-gas personal protective equipment as a precaution during combat operations. One can only imagine what the men of 1915 had to endure without any protection at all. Although a huge battle, fraught with confusion and desperate action, for the men of 2 battalions, the 10th and the 16th, their action in the retaking of Kitchener's Wood would stand out as the first Canadian offensive action of the war. Sadly, it was not to be recognized as a standalone battle honor when the enormous task of classification and the awarding of them fell to the committee so charged after the war. In an effort to recognize this brave action, petition was made to the government by the respective commanders of the post-war regiments to allow some sort of distinction to be granted in remembrance of the attack of the night of the 22nd of April. This was granted, and thereafter the regiments that perpetuated the battalions were granted the device of an oak leaf and acorn to be incorporated into their uniform. The 10th Battalion's lineage and legacy was absorbed by 2 regiments, the Calgary Highlanders and the Winnipeg Light Infantry. Although it took some time to finalize the design and issue the badge, These two regiments would incorporate their initials onto a large likeness of an oak leaf to be worn as a shoulder title. The Winnipeg Light Infantry were amalgamated in 1955, and the device ceased to be worn at that time. The 16th would be perpetuated by a new regiment formed in 1920, the Canadian Scottish. This regiment would replace two pre-war militia regiments, the 50th Gordons and the 88th Victoria Fusiliers. They were granted permission to incorporate the oak leaf in the center of their shoulder title, backed with red. Thus, the famous fight for Kitchener's Wood would be remembered in perpetuity on the uniform, rather than the colors of the units that took part. Today, the men and women of both regiments proudly wear their oak leaves in symbolic remembrance of the brave men of the 10th and the 16th who fell in that far-off, distant Flemish wood, and whose legacy formed the reputation that would be held by the Canadian Corps for the rest of the war. Today, two memorials stand as speaking directly to the battle for Kitchener's Wood. Canada's national memorial to the battles of Second Ypres stands at what has become known as Vancouver Corner, just north of St. Julian. Here, the brooding soldier casts his eyes down in mute remembrance of those who fell during April and May of 1915. Not far, up a narrow lane to the west, nestled beside a farmhouse and overlooking a wide open field where a wood once stood, is a small marker carved in the likeness of a stand of oak trees. This is the memorial to the men of the 10th and the 16th who fell during the night of April 22nd and April 23rd. It stands near the southwest corner of the wood, where the German machine guns caused so much trouble to the Canadian attack. Kitchener's Wood no longer exists, but its memory lives on. It is perhaps sobering to reflect on the fact that the magnitude of the battle, great though it was, would not be the end of things, nor even the greater part. The effort and cost of those days in April 1915 would have to be replicated and intensified for 3.5 more years. By then, the Canadian Corps would be diametrically opposed to the amateurs of 1915. So many lessons would be learned, and so much blood let. Nothing was simple, and nothing was straightforward. Heartbreaking loss and hard-won victory lay in the future. In the end, a reputation second to none would be their legacy. Many thanks to Michael of CanadianSoldiers.com for the use of some of his maps and images in the production of this video. His website is an incredible resource for information on Canada's soldier of the 20th century. Stop by and say hello. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. And for more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page.